$400. Not a cent more. Take it or leave. That's what my CEO said to me. She didn't yell, didn't even look annoyed. Just slid the paper across her desk like she was pushing a menu at a diner. Corporate calm. The kind that sounds polite but isn't. I swear I thought I misheard her. $400 per diem total, including airfare. It was an impossible ceiling for Denver in peak season. It wasn't an oversight. It was a constructive discharge, a way to make the job impossible, so I'd either fail or quit. If you do not like it, you can quit. That part wasn't on the paper. She just added it, almost casually, like seasoning. Now let me back up, because that line didn't come out of nowhere. My name is Helen Mercer. I run strategic accounts at Alderon Analytics out of Seattle. For 7 years, I have been the one getting on planes to Denver, Austin, San Francisco. I built the West Coast market for us from basically nothing. Horizon Systems in Denver 18% of our revenue, I know that number because I fought for it. Apparently, I also account for 37% of our travel budget. Victoria tapped the page. The board wants a 15% operational reduction. Travel is up 22% year over year. We need discipline. Discipline. Like I was a teenager sneaking out with a company card. I glanced at the skyline behind her. The room smelled faintly like burnt coffee. She'd probably been in back-to-back meetings all morning trying to look decisive. Does this apply to strategic accounts, I asked? Yes, across the board. Across the board. That's how they say you specifically without saying it. Seattle to Denver during business season can run more than $400 just for airfare. And she knew that. She is not stupid. MBA from Chicago, spreadsheet queen. This was not ignorance, this was strategy. Honestly, if you've ever had someone reduce years of your life to a cost center, you know that quiet feeling in your chest. Not anger, not yet. Just, okay. I said, can you send this to me in writing? She smiled. Of course. I signed the acknowledgement when the email came through. No argument, no speech. Then I stood up and said, thank you for everything. I saw it hit her. She expected a fight or panic. Instead, I gave her calm. Walking back to my office, I kept thinking about one thing. If I follow this rule exactly, something is going to break. I just didn't know who first. I did exactly what she told me to do. I booked the cheapest flight to Denver. One layover in Boise, 5 hours sitting in an airport that smelled like fryer oil and burnt coffee. I almost paid the extra for a direct flight. My finger hovered over the button. Then I heard her voice in my head. $400, not a cent more. So I closed the tab. The hotel was 20 minutes outside downtown. Thin towels. The hallway carpet smelled faintly like bleach. I kept every receipt. I swear I triple-checked the totals like I was studying for an exam. Horizon's quarterly review started stiff. Daniel Reyes nodded when I walked in. Not warm, not cold, just measuring. You took the late arrival, he asked. Budget cap, I replied. Had to. He didn't comment. Just moved into slides. We got through projections. Expansion timeline. Then their infrastructure lead. Marisol leaned forward. There's an issue with the migration sequence. We flagged it last night. I saw the email on the flight. I told her, let's walk through it. We did. It wasn't catastrophic, but it needed someone with authority to make a call. Around 8 that night, Daniel looked at me. Are you staying to finish this? My flight's at 6 in the morning. I answered. Change fee would push me over. Silence. Marisol glanced between us. So, what's the decision? I pulled up the revised policy email on my phone and slid it across the table. I'm operating under new travel limits. I can advise. Final approval will have to go through Alderon tomorrow. Daniel's jaw tightened. We needed you here. I'm here now, I said. Calm. Within policy. That's the shift right there. Before, I would have stayed, paid the difference myself if I had to. This time I didn't. We wrapped without full resolution. The next morning at the airport, Daniel called. Why weren't you there when we escalated? I followed the approved travel policy. A long pause. Understood. He finally said, not angry, just different. That's when I felt it. Nothing exploded, but something moved. The email came in at 9:17 on a Tuesday. Subject line expense clarification request. From finance. Please clarify $86 taxi reimbursement from Q2 last year. $86. I stared at it longer than I should have. That was the Denver trip where Horizon almost walked. I stayed until midnight in a server room that smelled like hot plastic and dust. Daniel and I sat on folding chairs while their engineers untangled a migration mess. We secured a renewal worth just under $200,000 that quarter. Now I was explaining a taxi. I replied within 10 minutes. Attached the receipt, added context, kept it clean. 5 minutes later, another email. Please provide additional documentation for client dinner reimbursement. $142. That dinner was the night Daniel told me Horizon was considering expansion into Texas. I remember because I picked up the check without thinking. It wasn't about food. It was about momentum. I walked down to finance. Marcy, who I'd worked with for years, wouldn't meet my eyes. Is this coming from you, I asked? She exhaled. It's part of the new review initiative, travel efficiency initiative. Her silence confirmed it. Victoria already presented savings to the board, didn't she? Marcy hesitated. She highlighted projected reductions. Projected, not actual. So if those savings didn't materialize, someone needed to look excessive. Me. I went back to my office and opened the internal leadership memo Trent accidentally forwarded to the wrong distribution list. Strategic cost correction achieved through travel controls. Achieved. I hadn't even finished my first under-budget quarter. This wasn't about discipline. It was about optics. I forwarded every audit email to my personal archive. Not to fight, just to document. If I was going to be the proof of savings, I needed to see what the savings were really costing. The meeting invite came from Victoria herself. Strategic alignment session Horizon systems. Mandatory. I walked into the conference room and Trent Wallace was already there. Laptop open, posture straight like he was auditioning. 32. Smart. Eager. Clean haircut. The kind of guy who believes process fixes everything. Victoria stood at the head of the table. I want to formally introduce Trent as co-lead on Horizon. She announced, no system should depend on one individual. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. Trent gave me a quick smile. Looking forward to learning from you. I nodded. You'll learn fast. The call with Horizon started 10 minutes later. Daniel appeared on screen. Marisol next to him. Trent led. He went slide by slide. Metrics. Timeline. Cost efficiency. Clean delivery. Halfway through, Daniel leaned back. Let's talk about the expansion into Texas. Trent clicked to a forecast model. We've mapped projected resource allocation based on standardized growth curves. Daniel didn't respond to the slide. He looked at me. Do you think this team is ready for that pace? Trent jumped in. Our internal assessment indicates operational readiness. Internal assessment. That's not what Daniel was asking. I cleared my throat. Expansion depends on how stable the current migration remains over the next quarter. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. He caught it. So there are concerns. Variables. I replied, carefully. The call ended without commitment. 2 days later, Daniel emailed, we are postponing the 3-year renewal decision pending further evaluation. Not cancellation. Delay. Victoria stormed into my office. What happened in that meeting? We presented the plan. I told her. And they're not convinced by slides. Her jaw tightened. They need to understand this company doesn't revolve around you. I didn't argue, but I felt it. If leadership becomes interchangeable, loyalty might be too. Daniel called me on a Thursday night. No calendar invite. Just my phone lighting up while I was halfway through reheating leftovers. I'm going to ask you something direct. He started. Who has authority on our account right now? Not how are you. Not small talk. My authority has been adjusted. I answered. Adjusted how I can advise. Final approvals route through executive review. There was a pause. I could hear paper shuffling on his end. That wasn't the structure when we signed, he continued. We signed because you could make calls in real time. I understand. Do you? It wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was cautious. I'm still accountable for delivery. I told him. Within policy. So, accountability without authority. I didn't respond to that. Later that afternoon, Trent stopped by my desk. Legal from Horizon requested documentation on decision workflow. He mentioned, they're doing an internal risk review. That makes sense, I replied. He hesitated. Is this about the travel cap? It's about consistency. He looked uncomfortable. Victoria thinks we can stabilize once they see the numbers. The numbers? An hour later, I got pulled into a leadership update. Victoria stood in front of a screen showing quarterly projections. The board wants a stability forecast for strategic accounts. She announced, we need to show confidence. I spoke carefully. Restoring direct account authority would strengthen that forecast. Her eyes locked onto mine. That would undermine our cost discipline narrative before the quarter closes. So there it was. She couldn't reverse it. Not because she didn't want to, because she already told the board she had control after the meeting. She stopped me in the hallway. You're not helping. I'm operating within policy, I replied. She exhaled slowly. We need them to trust the system. I thought about that. Trust doesn't come from systems. It comes from people. But I didn't say it. I just went back to my desk and opened my email. Horizon's legal team had CC'd me on a request titled Continuity of Leadership Assurance. That word stuck with me. Assurance. The escalation email from Horizon came in at 7:43 in the morning. Subject line, immediate integration concern. 3 days before their renewal deadline. By 8:10, Victoria was standing at my desk. Conference room. Now, no greeting. Inside, Trent was already on speaker with Daniel and Marisol. Daniel's voice was tight. The integration sequence isn't aligning with the Texas expansion timeline. We need decisive guidance. Victoria jumped in. We're fully committed to stabilizing this. She looked at me. Book a flight. Today. I kept my voice steady. I will go, but I need a formal budget override in the system first. Without it, the integration delay will be documented as a policy constraint, not a performance failure. I'm not renegotiating. I'm mitigating the audit risk for both of us. The room went quiet. Victoria turned slowly. This is not the time to renegotiate policy. I'm not renegotiating, I replied. I need authorization to stay through resolution without budget restriction. Trent shifted in his chair. We can handle this remotely. Daniel cut in. Remote isn't working. Victoria's jaw tightened. We've reduced travel spend by 12% this quarter. I'm not reversing that before board reporting. So I don't have full authority, I asked. You have enough. Enough to be accountable. Her silence answered that. Daniel spoke again. Who has final decision authority on expansion timing? Victoria glanced at me. Executive review, she answered. Daniel exhaled. That delay affects our capital planning. I leaned forward. I can be on the ground this afternoon. With restored authority, Victoria shook her head. We can't undermine our cost correction initiative. Cost correction. I felt something inside me settle. Then I cannot guarantee stabilization. I said, it wasn't dramatic, just a line. Victoria stared at me like I'd betrayed her. You're choosing policy over partnership. I'm choosing clarity over ambiguity. The call ended without resolution. Back at my desk, Trent avoided eye contact. You could have just gone, he muttered. And explain the expense afterward, I replied. That's not discipline. That's defiance. He didn't argue. That night, I sat alone in my apartment. The air carried a faint salt smell from the bay when I cracked the window. My phone buzzed twice with unread emails. I didn't check them. For the first time, I wondered if she was right. Maybe I'd become expensive. Maybe I was protecting pride. Then I replayed the call. Authority without permission isn't authority. It's liability. I wasn't stepping back to prove a point. I was refusing to carry weight that wasn't mine anymore. The renewal deadline was 3 days away. I closed my laptop and let the silence stretch. Tomorrow would show whether the system could stand without me. The email came at 10:12 in the morning. Subject renewal decision update. I opened it before anyone called me into a room. Horizon Systems will postpone renewal pending leadership stability review. Not termination, not approval. Postpone. Trent walked past my desk 5 minutes later. Pale. They delayed. He murmured, I saw... Victoria called an emergency executive session with the board that afternoon. I wasn't invited. Obviously. But walls in corporate offices aren't as thick as people think. Later, she briefed leadership. They're overreacting, she insisted. This is temporary hesitation. An older board member's voice carried through the partially closed door. Why were strategic personnel shifted mid-cycle cost discipline required operational adjustments? Victoria replied, "Did we evaluate relational dependency risk?" Another voice asked. "We can't allow accounts to hinge on individual travel habits." The board's audit didn't just look at travel receipts, they looked at key person dependency. By forcing me out through petty budget constraints, Victoria had created a single point of failure for 18% of the firm's revenue. That's not discipline. That's reckless endangerment of shareholder value. I kept working at my desk, answering routine emails like nothing was cracking. An hour later, Victoria stepped out, composed but tighter around the eyes. "The board has frozen further restructuring until audit review," she informed us. "We need to present stability." Trent looked at me. This time, he didn't try to argue process. I didn't smile. I didn't react. Daniel called later. "We're reviewing continuity planning internally." He told me, "I understand. This isn't personal." I know. And that was the truth. No one yelled. No contracts exploded. But 18% of our annual revenue was now suspended in midair. Metrics look clean on slides. They don't show hesitation in someone's voice. I shut my laptop that evening and waited for the next move to surface. Horizon didn't renew. The official notice came in clean. Legal language. After internal review, we've decided not to proceed with the 3-year extension. Victoria forwarded it to leadership with one line. "We anticipated volatility." I didn't respond. 30 days passed. No drama, just space. Then Daniel called. "We'd like to explore something different," he began. "A retainer-based advisory arrangement. Directly with you?" I stayed quiet long enough for him to continue. "We don't need your company. We need your judgment. I'm under a non-compete," I reminded him. "Does it prevent you from accepting work?" Daniel asked. I'd already cleared this with my counsel. The non-compete covers solicitation of Alderon's active contracts. But since Horizon officially terminated their renewal, their RFP was a new market event. I've reviewed the language. I told him, "As long as the client initiates the bridge, I'm in the clear. I want this clean." He added, "So do I." I met with an employment attorney 2 days later. She read through my contract, tapping the page with her pen. "You can't approach them," she explained. "But they approached you. That's different. You'll need clear documentation of the timeline." "I've kept everything," I replied. "We structured it carefully. Fixed monthly retainer. Strategic advisory scope only. No access to Alderon proprietary systems. No overlap with active contracts." Daniel reviewed the draft. "You're charging less than I expected," he commented. "I'm charging what reflects stability," I answered. He paused. "We trust you." I signed. No applause. No fireworks. Just a clean transfer of weight. When I left the attorney's office, I noticed something small. I didn't have to calculate whether the taxi ride back would exceed a cap. I submitted my resignation on a Monday morning. 2 weeks' notice. Clean. Professional. Victoria called me in within the hour. "So this is your response?" she asked, holding the letter between 2 fingers. "It's a transition," I replied. "You're aware you're bound by non-disclosure." "I've honored every agreement." Her eyes narrowed. "Horizon's timing feels convenient. They conducted their own review," I said evenly. "I didn't initiate contact. You benefited." I complied. That irritated her more than anything. I handed over transition documents, account summaries, client timelines. No missing files. No sabotage. Trent reviewed the materials with me. "You're really leaving," he muttered. "Yes, was it worth it? I'm not sure yet." That was honest. By the end of the week, leadership received notice the board had expanded the audit to include revenue volatility tied to travel restructuring. Victoria called another executive meeting. The board is temporarily reassigning travel budget approval to finance oversight, she announced. This is procedural, meaning she no longer controlled it. She wasn't fired, not publicly embarrassed, just repositioned away from strategic account authority. After the meeting, she stopped me near the elevators. "You could have stayed and fixed this." "I tried," I answered. The doors opened. I stepped inside carrying only my laptop and my old leather notebook. Control doesn't disappear in explosions. Sometimes it just gets redistributed quietly. 6 months later, I'm boarding a direct flight from Seattle to Denver. Business class, not flashy, just practical. And yes, Horizon covers the direct flight now without blinking. They don't see a cost, they see an investment. Daniel meets me at Horizon's office. Feels different this time. He says as we shake hands, "It is different." I reply, "Now I answer to the work." He nods. "We needed stability, not austerity. And you needed authority attached to accountability." We sit down with his team. Marisol runs through expansion numbers. No one asks who has permission. They ask what I think. That's the shift. Halfway through the meeting, Daniel pulls me aside. "The board asked about Alderon." I wait. "Victoria's been reassigned from strategic oversight." He continues. "Audit confirmed revenue volatility tied to restructuring. Not fired. Just moved out of the driver's seat. That makes sense." I say, "She thought your travel was a burden?" "It wasn't travel." I answer, "It was proximity." Later, as I close my notebook, I realize something simple. There's a difference between cost and value. Cost is what you see on paper. Value is what keeps something standing when pressure hits. When someone strips your authority but keeps your responsibility, that's not discipline. That's control. And control eventually exposes itself. In the end, Victoria managed the spreadsheet, but I managed the social capital. If you find yourself being reduced to a line item, remember a company can buy your time, but they have to earn your relationships. Everything else is just overhead. They thought my travel was a burden. They forgot it was the bridge. They owned the name on the building. I owned the names in my notebook. And that part, no policy ever controlled. By the time the CEO's son refused to shake my hand, the deal was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. The room didn't either. They thought I was there to observe, to approve paperwork, to sit quietly at the edge of a table built by their last name. What they didn't understand was simple. Without the $2.9 billion I controlled, nothing in that room would close. And when he dismissed me in front of the board, he didn't insult me. He reclassified the capital. By the next morning, that capital was no longer theirs, and neither was the illusion of control. Whitmore Tower stood where the old brick headquarters used to be. I'd been there years ago when the founder's portrait hung in the lobby. Oil paint, stern expression, a man who built things slowly. That portrait was gone. In its place, a wall-sized digital display flashing the company's new slogan, "Accelerate boldly." The marble floors were newer, the glass cleaner, the branding sharper. But something else was gone too. Memory. 20 years ago, I sat in another boardroom like this, another charismatic executive promising growth no one could responsibly finance. 3 years later, I stood in a union hall facing retired factory workers who had just learned their pensions were gone. No yelling, no theatrics, just men and women in their late 60s recalculating whether they could afford insulin. That was the day I stopped confusing charm with stewardship. And I never made that mistake again. At the security desk, I handed over my ID. The receptionist clipped a temporary badge to my jacket. Visitor Mercer Institutional Capital. Visitor. I didn't correct it. In my portfolio were the final confirmations for $2.9 billion in institutional anchor capital money that didn't belong to me. It belonged to teachers, to firefighters, to public workers who had trusted the system to protect their retirement. I wasn't here to be impressive. I wasn't here to be included. I was here to make sure the room understood who was carrying the weight. The elevator doors closed, and I reminded myself respect is not requested. It is structured. The boardroom was already half full when I entered. Men and women in their 50s and 60s, directors who had weathered recessions. Some I recognized, some pretended not to. I took my seat quietly. Not at the head of the table, not at the end, somewhere in the middle, close enough to matter. The door opened a few minutes later. Daniel Whitmore walked in like someone who had rehearsed this day for years. It was his first major meeting since his father had formally introduced him as co-president the month before. The company newsletter had called it a generational transition. The business press called it legacy continuity. He shook hands with the senior directors first, firm, confident, measured eye contact. When he reached me, that I stood and extended my hand, and he looked at my badge. Visitor Mercer Institutional Capital. His eyes flicked back to my face, and then he smiled, not warmly. Politely, "But we don't need vendor reps at the strategic table," he said. A small pause, then he added, almost lightly, "This is leadership session." There it was, not confusion. Dismissal. Someone at the far end of the table let out a soft chuckle and immediately masked it with a cough. Another director said, "Let's stay focused," without looking at me. The CFO did not smile. I kept my hand extended. Not pleading, not offended, just present. Daniel waited for me to correct him. I didn't. I lowered my hand slowly, on my own terms, then and returned to my seat. He moved on as if nothing had happened. "Legal will handle capital sign-off," he said. Opening the merger deck, we're aligned there, across the table. I saw it, the flicker in the CFO's eyes. That was the moment. Not the insult, the assumption. Daniel wasn't trying to belittle me. He was trying to prove something. To his father, to the board, maybe to himself. He had been handed a seat at the table and was determined to show he controlled it. But he didn't understand the room. And rooms like this don't punish ego. They punish miscalculation. I folded my hands and listened. Without that money, the deal couldn't legally close. And he had just declared he didn't need the person who controlled it. Chapter 3, What He Didn't Understand. Let me explain something without turning this into a finance lecture. The $2.9 billion wasn't sitting in Whitmore's account, waiting to be spent like discretionary cash. It was waiting for recognition. Structured, protected, conditional. That money represented teachers' pensions, firefighters' retirement funds, public workers who had already lived through one executive's overconfidence. It represented people who had trusted the wrong room once before and paid for it with years they couldn't earn back. It wasn't my money. It was my responsibility. And responsibility has rules. If Whitmore Industries wanted that capital released, they had to formally recognize the authority behind it. Not socially, not symbolically, but structurally. And that wasn't ego, that was protection. Buried in the agreement between the valuation models and the closing conditions was a clause most executives skim past because it feels technical. It wasn't dramatic language. It wasn't written to intimidate anyone. It was written to prevent exactly what had happened. In simple terms, it said this: if the person legally responsible for the capital is publicly dismissed, excluded, or materially misrepresented during governance proceedings tied to the transaction, the commitment automatically moves into review, not withdrawn, not punished, reviewed. That distinction matters. Review doesn't remove money overnight. It pauses certainty. And in large transactions, certainty is oxygen. Banks don't wait for emotion to cool down. They wait for clarity. And if clarity disappears even briefly, credit tightens. Without confirmed anchor capital, the merger could not legally close. It wasn't personal. It was structural. After the meeting ended, I didn't storm out. I didn't correct Daniel in the hallway. I didn't demand an apology. I sat in my car and replayed the room. Was this pride or was it risk? If he had pulled me aside privately and clarified roles, that would have been different, but he hadn't. He had reframed the authority behind the capital in front of the board, or STA, in the very session where governance alignment was being documented, and that mattered. It mattered because rooms remember. And if a board accepts a misrepresentation in silence, that silence becomes precedent. I opened my laptop and drafted one email. Subject: Notice of Governance. Irregularity review. Required no emotion. No accusation. Just timestamps. Just facts. Just reference to the clause both sides had signed. Because governance isn't emotional. It's procedural. And procedure exists for the moments when confidence outruns discipline. The hotel room was quiet in the way only business hotels are quiet, thick curtains. Muted lighting. The hum of distant traffic softened by glass. I set my portfolio on the desk but didn't open it. Instead, I stood by the window and watched the city lights blur into reflection. If I'm wrong, I said softly to the empty room, this will cost more than pride. Deals collapse. Jobs get affected. Headlines get written by people who weren't in the room. And even when you're right, markets don't always care. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of that. This wasn't about winning an argument. This was about pulling friction into a machine already in motion. I sat down and replayed the meeting in my head. Daniel's tone. The subtle smile at the far end of the table. The CFO's pause. Had I misread it? Had I reacted too quickly? Or had I simply refused to normalize something that would echo later? I picked up the phone and called my senior partner. He answered immediately. I saw your email. He said, do we escalate? We don't escalate, I replied. We document. A quiet pause. And convert the status, yes. Another pause longer this time. You're certain? I looked at my reflection in the window. No, I wasn't certain. Certainty is a luxury in rooms like that. Discipline is not. If we ignore this, I said quietly, that we're telling every boardroom that capital authority is ceremonial, that it's optional. He exhaled slowly. You know what that triggers? I do. Once it moves to review, the banks will react. Yes. Silence again. Then, simply understood. The status shifted. Committed became conditional review. Nothing dramatic happened in that moment. No alarms, no notifications in the room around me. Just a classification change in a system designed for exactly this purpose. I turned off the lights and lay down. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I felt responsible, and that was enough to sleep. At 7:12 a.m., the status changed. No announcement, no headline, just a quiet update in a compliance system most people never think about. Committed to conditional review. That single shift meant one thing: the money was no longer assumed. By 8:47 a.m., the first alert reached Northbridge's risk desk. A governance review flag attached to $2.9 billion in anchor capital is not something lenders ignore. It doesn't matter how strong the projections look. If the foundation moves, the structure pauses. By 9 o'clock a.m., the banks noticed. By 9:03, the CFO's phone rang. We need confirmation of anchor stability, the risk officer said evenly. We've received a review notice. It's procedural. Mark Halpern replied. We're clarifying. Until it's clarified, the voice answered. Our exposure committee will suspend leverage. That was the moment the oxygen thinned. Without confirmed anchor capital, the merger couldn't legally close. Not emotionally, not reputationally. Legally. Daniel Whitmore was not in the CFO's office when that call ended. He was rehearsing a media briefing. At 9:30 a.m., my phone rang. His name on the screen? There seems to be a misinterpretation, he said carefully. There was a representation. I replied. A beat of silence. You're overreacting. I'm responding. He exhaled sharply. You're putting thousands of jobs at risk over a misunderstanding. That's not what put them at risk, I said quietly. Uncertainty did. At 10:15 a.m., the formal notice came through. Bridge leverage suspended pending capital confirmation. Secondary lenders froze exposure. Underwriting partners flagged the transaction for review. Without the anchor commitment confirmed, the deal fell below its minimum closing threshold. Not collapsed, below threshold, which, in practice, is the same. Inside Whitmore's executive suite, Mark Halpern walked into Daniel's office with a tablet in his hand. We can't close, he said. Daniel looked up sharply. What do you mean we can't close the capitals in review? Daniel stood. Review isn't withdrawal. Halpern didn't raise his voice. In this market, he said quietly, it's the same. Silence. The kind that doesn't erupt. The kind that recalculates. Daniel's jaw tightened. For the first time since stepping into the boardroom the day before, he wasn't defending a position. He was realizing the weight of it. Not because I had pulled money, but because I had removed certainty. And markets, like people, do not tolerate rooms that misrepresent who holds the authority to decide. The emergency board meeting was not loud. No one slammed binders. No one raised their voice. It was controlled. Which is worse, controlled rooms don't explode. They adjust. The independent director spoke first, and his tone steady. Did you dismiss the capital signatory during session? Daniel sat upright. Jaw set. I clarified roles, he said. There was confusion about who was handling documentation. Across the table, Mark Halpern didn't soften it. You misrepresented them, the CFO said. In a recorded governance proceeding, Daniel turned slightly toward him. That's an interpretation. It's a fact, Halpern replied. And then, for the first time since the meeting began, Thomas Whitmore spoke. He had built the company over 4 decades. He rarely needed volume to command attention. He didn't look at me. He looked at his son. Did you know she was the controlling authority over the capital? He asked quietly. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it. His hands were resting on the table. They trembled, only slightly, but enough. Thomas saw it, so did I. I assumed legal would process it, Daniel said finally. That wasn't the question, Thomas replied. Another silence. He leaned back in his chair, studying his son with something deeper than anger. Disappointment carries more weight than fury. I gave you this seat, Thomas said, his voice low but steady. You were supposed to protect it. Not protect your ego, not protect your image, protect the room. Daniel swallowed. For the first time, he looked younger than his title. No one rushed to defend him. Not because they disliked him, because they understood the consequence. Thomas turned to me then. His expression wasn't hostile, it was sober. Is there a path forward, he asked. There is a path to discipline, I said evenly. Not to erasure, I wasn't there to destroy the company. I was there to correct a fracture before it widened. The independent director cleared his throat. We need to initiate a governance review. A motion was made, seconded, not unanimously at first. 2 directors resisted, arguing the response had been disproportionate, but the weight of the compliance notice, the lender reaction, the market slide those facts didn't bend, the vote passed, governance review initiated, merger suspended pending confirmation. Daniel removed from deal authority during investigation, not expelled, not publicly humiliated, corrected. The room shifted. You could feel it. From ego to survival. And in that shift, everyone finally understood what the handshake had cost. Headlines moved faster than facts. By mid-afternoon, financial networks were running banners across the bottom of their screens. Anchor Capital under review. Governance dispute delays $18 billion merger. Commentators filled the gaps with speculation. Some called it fiduciary discipline, a necessary correction in a market that had grown too comfortable with legacy succession. Others called it excessive rigidity. Was this an overreaction, one analyst asked? Did one exchange justify destabilizing a transaction of this scale? The stock dropped 12% before the closing bell, not catastrophic, but sharp enough to rattle confidence. Daniel released a statement before sunset. It described the situation as procedural clarification. It emphasized continuity, resilience, and long-term strength. Markets don't react to tone, they react to doubt, and doubt had entered the bloodstream. Inside Whitmore's headquarters, the atmosphere changed. The first few days were tense. Directors met in smaller clusters. Some privately argued that the clause had been too aggressively enforced. Others questioned whether Daniel had been set up to fail. Family businesses are rarely clean. They carry pride like inheritance. Behind closed doors, not everyone agreed with the reforms being drafted. 2 senior board members pushed back hard against removing Daniel from deal authority. One suggested that doing so would signal instability to competitors. The independent director responded bluntly, "What signals instability is pretending nothing happened. The governance vote passed, but not without friction, and friction leaves marks." Thomas Whitmore called me 3 days later, not from the executive suite, from his home office. His voice was quieter than it had been in the boardroom. "I built this company on relationships," he said. "Trust, personal loyalty, long memory. I didn't interrupt, but I also built it on discipline." He continued, "And I may have confused the two. There it was. Not an apology. Recognition. Relationships require recognition," I said. "Otherwise, they become assumptions." He was silent for a moment. "I thought I was preparing him," he said finally. "I didn't realize I was shielding him." That is the risk in succession. You protect someone long enough, and they mistake protection for authority. He didn't argue. He didn't ask me to reverse the review. He understood that this wasn't about punishing his son. It was about protecting the system his son would someday inherit. And systems, unlike reputations, do not survive on loyalty alone. The emails came in waves. Some were measured and professional. Others were sharp. Half said I had protected integrity, that governance meant nothing if it bent under pressure. Half said I had destabilized jobs that in a fragile market, even a temporary review could ripple outward into layoffs, frozen hiring, stalled expansion. Neither side was entirely wrong. Late one afternoon, a junior analyst from our team stood in my doorway. She had been with us less than 2 years. Smart, careful, still learning how power moves. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She hesitated. Was it worth it? It wasn't accusatory, it was genuine. On the credenza behind my desk sat a framed photograph I kept for reasons most people in finance don't understand. It showed a group of factory workers from 2 decades ago, men and women in their 60s standing under fluorescent lights in a union hall, holding envelopes they hadn't expected to receive. The envelopes weren't bonuses, they were explanations. Their pensions had collapsed after a CEO insisted everything was under control. I looked at that photo. "If discipline costs us opportunity," I said slowly, "then opportunity was mispriced." She nodded, but I could see she was still thinking about it. After she left, the office felt quieter. That night, at home, the question returned. Was it worth it? 12% market drop? Public scrutiny? A succession thrown into uncertainty. I poured a glass of water and stood by the kitchen window, staring at nothing in particular. If I had ignored the dismissal, the merger likely would have closed smoothly. No headlines, no volatility, but what precedent would that have set? I didn't answer the question easily. Conviction isn't loud, it's something you test in silence. And sometimes, even when you know you acted responsibly, you still sit with the weight of what responsibility costs. 6 weeks later, governance reforms were enacted. Not smoothly, not unanimously. The headlines had faded. But inside Whitmore Industries, the adjustments were still grinding through committees and late-night calls. An independent oversight committee was formed, chaired by the same director who had first asked the uncomfortable question in the emergency session. Its mandate was simple: on paper review succession protocols, clarify capital authority recognition, and codify escalation triggers. In practice, it meant rewriting habits, and habits resist revision. 2 directors argued openly against the extent of the changes. One warned that overcorrection would signal weakness to competitors. Another suggested the board had overlearned from a single incident. But markets had not forgotten the 12% drop. Banks had not forgotten the compliance flag. Memory has leverage. Daniel was formally removed from the succession track pending governance certification and board reevaluation. It wasn't announced as a demotion. It was framed as developmental recalibration. Corporate language is often gentler than reality. Thomas retained the CEO role temporarily. Publicly, he called it continuity. Privately, it was stabilization. 6 weeks after the initial review notice, Whitmore's general counsel requested a formal meeting with Mercer Capital. No assumptions this time. Before any slide deck was opened, before any valuation models were referenced, the first item entered into the minutes was a written acknowledgement of fiduciary authority. Representation requirements. Clear, recorded, unambiguous. Daniel was not in the room. Thomas was. The oversight committee chair was. The CFO was. The tone was different. Less performance, more precision. I listened. I asked questions. I watched for posture, not projections. When I finally signed the amended capital release agreement, it wasn't a restoration of the old structure. It was a revised one. Permanent board seat tied to anchor capital representation. Automatic escalation triggers for governance misalignment. Mandatory certification in fiduciary governance for all future executive successors. Protection, not punishment. As I closed my folder, Thomas met my eyes. This time, there was no assumption in the room, only structure. And structure, when respected, outlasts legacy. It happened without witnesses. No board members, no legal counsel, no headlines waiting to interpret the moment. Evelyn was walking toward the elevators when Daniel Whitmore stepped out of a conference room down the hall. He paused when he saw her. For a brief second, the weight of everything that had happened stood between them, not hostile, just acknowledged. He approached first, not quickly, not defensively. I asked to sit in on the oversight committee. He said, as an observer, there was no pride in the statement, only effort. Then he extended his hand. I misunderstood the room. This time, he did not look at her badge. He looked at her. Evelyn studied him quietly. Growth rarely announces itself with speeches. It shows up in posture, its intonement, and humility. She took his hand. Power isn't inherited, she said. It's recognized. The elevator doors opened behind them. But before stepping inside, she added gently, and recognition starts with listening. Daniel nodded once. I'm still learning, he said. That mattered more than the apology. They entered separately. The doors closed. No applause, no victory music, just forward motion. There's a lesson here that extends far beyond boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. Respect is not about courtesy. It is about structure. It is about understanding who holds responsibility and honoring it before you're forced to. When we dismiss people based on assumption, we often misunderstand the room. And when discipline feels uncomfortable, that discomfort is usually protecting something larger than pride. And if I had stayed silent that day, no one would have known, except me. That is often where integrity lives, not in public victories, but in private decisions. If this story made you reflect on a moment where you were underestimated or where you may have underestimated someone else, I'd love to hear it. What would you have done in Daniel's position? Would you have triggered the review if you were in Evelyn's seat? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might help someone else recognize the room they're standing in. And if you value stories about accountability, legacy, and quiet strength, consider subscribing. The next story explores a different kind of power and a different kind of room. Sometimes the hardest lesson isn't learning to lead, it's learning to listen. B4 was never meant to impress anyone. It was the operations garage concrete, oil stains, early shift supervisors, delivery drivers grabbing coffee before sunrise. Executives usually parked upstairs, closer to the glass lobby and polished floors. That morning, I chose B4 on purpose. I had helped design this building 22 years ago. Back then, my name signed off on construction budgets and compliance plans. Today, officially, I was listed as founding board advisor, which is corporate language for respected, but no longer in daily control. Most of the employees down here had never met me. That was fine. I preferred it that way. I eased my sedan into the space marked Reserved Executive. The sign was new. The paint on the floor wasn't. I shut off the engine and stayed seated for a moment, listening to the building hum awake. Forklifts in the distance, truck doors slamming, radios crackling. Then a black sports car swung in fast and stopped sideways in front of my hood. Not an accident, a statement. The driver's door flew open and a young woman stepped out, phone already raised, camera facing her. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to the internet. "Look at this," she said brightly into her live stream. "Some old lady just parked in Daniel Price's spot." She turned the phone so her viewers could see my car. "He runs HR," she continued. "And trust me, everyone listens to him." Her name tag read, Lily Carter, intern, 3 weeks in the building at most. The ink on her badge still looked fresh. I stepped out of my car, slowly. "I'm sorry," I said calmly, loud enough for her phone to pick up. "Is this Mr. Price's space?" She smiled sharp. Confident, very sure of herself. "Yes," she said. "And he doesn't like people disrespecting him." Behind her, 2 warehouse supervisors had paused mid-conversation. A driver leaned against his truck, watching. No one intervened. Not because they were afraid of her, because they were careful around Daniel. I looked at the sign again, then I nodded. "Congratulations," I said. Her smile widened, as if she'd won something important. I got back into my car, reversed slowly, and moved to an unmarked space across the row. As I walked toward the stairwell, I heard her laugh into her phone. "See, that's how you handle it." I didn't correct her. Correcting her would have ended the performance, and I needed her to keep performing, halfway to the stairs. My phone vibrated. A text. "Daniel Price, we need to talk. Now, no greeting, no context, just urgency." I didn't answer. Instead, I stepped into the concrete stairwell and let the heavy door close behind me. Daniel Price had been promoted to HR director 5 years ago. I had signed the recommendation myself. At the time, he was competent, organized, quietly ambitious. Now, apparently, that he had an intern live streaming parking disputes in his name. That told me 2 things. First, he had been building a reputation I hadn't approved. Second, he was confident enough to believe no one above him was watching. He was wrong. At the top of the stairs, I paused and looked back down through the opening. Lily was still filming, still smiling, still narrating her victory. She thought she had defended her boss. She had no idea she had just introduced him to the wrong audience. And this time, there would be no live stream to edit what came next. By the time I reached the main floor, it was still early. Operations staff moved with purpose, clipboards, tablets, coffee cups. No one stopped me. No one greeted me. That was the point of becoming invisible. I stepped into the small founder suite at the end of the corridor. It wasn't impressive anymore, just a modest office the board had never reassigned, a courtesy space, a relic. I set my bag down. My phone buzzed again. "Daniel," this time I answered. "What exactly are you doing in my garage?" he asked without greeting. "Your garage. Not the company's, not the building's. His." "I parked," I said. Then I moved. A pause. "You embarrassed one of my team members," he replied, calm, controlled, the voice of a man used to correcting other people. "Your intern," I said. "She represents HR," he answered, "and HR represents policy." There it was, not power. Proximity to power. You've been here long enough to know how perception works. Daniel continued. When staff see a former executive ignoring posted rules, it creates confusion. Former executive. Interesting phrasing. I saw a sign. I said, I moved when I was told it was yours. Another pause. She shouldn't have live streamed it, he admitted. That was unnecessary, but not wrong. That's what he meant. I'd appreciate it. He continued, if you didn't escalate this, we're approaching sensitive negotiations. The last thing we need is internal drama. Sensitive negotiations. That got my attention. With whom I asked. That's not relevant to you, he said smoothly. That told me everything. Negotiations meant leverage. Leverage meant someone wanted something. And when HR starts guarding parking spaces like territory, it usually isn't about parking. Daniel, I said evenly, why does an intern feel comfortable speaking for you publicly? She's ambitious. He replied, I mentor ambitious people. And do you also encourage them to threaten employees on camera? His tone cooled. She didn't threaten anyone. She implied retaliation. I said, in your name. Silence stretched longer this time. Then you're not operational anymore, Daniel said. You don't see what I see. This company needs stronger boundaries, not nostalgia. Stronger boundaries. From HR. Interesting. I signed your promotion letter, I said quietly. And I've grown since then, he replied. That wasn't arrogance, that was a warning. We'll handle it internally. He continued, there's no need for you to insert yourself. Insert myself into the company I built. I won't insert myself, I said. Unless I have to. We both understood the meaning. If he kept this small, I would keep it small. If he didn't, I wouldn't. Good, he said. The line disconnected. No goodbye. I set the phone down slowly. On my desk sat a framed photograph from 20 years ago. A ribbon-cutting ceremony. Hard hats, smiles, Daniel in the background. 3 rows back, barely visible. Back then, influence had to be earned. Now it seemed to be performed. I opened my laptop and logged into the internal dashboard. I still had access to not administrative control, but visibility. Visibility was enough. If Daniel was guarding territory, something of value was nearby. And parking spaces were rarely the real issue. Later that morning, the building settled into its usual rhythm. From my small office, I could hear the steady hum of routing calls and dispatch confirmations. Nothing looked unusual on the surface. Orders were moving. Trucks were leaving on schedule. Screens and operations glowed green. If Daniel was right, this should have ended in the garage. It didn't. 10 minutes after our call, an internal notification appeared on my dashboard. Not dramatic, not flashing red, just a small flag in the compliance feed, temporary access override zone. Zone C, housed restricted shipping data. International routing contracts, volume agreements, carrier penalty structures, not something interns casually wandered through. The timestamp read 8:14 a.m., right around the time Lily had been live streaming in B4. I clicked into the details. Access granted through a temporary escort credential. Holder L. Carter Temp, not executive clearance. Escorted clearance. That meant someone with authority had walked her through a restricted area and used their own credentials to open the doors. I leaned back slowly. This wasn't a rogue intern hacking systems. This was someone bringing her inside. I checked the access chain. The escort credential had been issued under HR onboarding privileges. Daniel's department. He hadn't personally scanned in, but he didn't need to. HR had the ability to generate temporary escort passes for orientation purposes. It was meant for vendor tours and compliance training, not live stream content. I closed the window and sat very still. If Lily had only been loud in a parking garage, this would have been embarrassing. If she had recorded anything inside Zone C, it was different. I opened the internal media monitoring panel, a tool we use to track unauthorized disclosures. Within seconds, a flagged clip appeared. It wasn't obvious at first, just a shaky video posted to her social account. But in the background, barely visible behind her shoulder, were screens displaying live carrier penalty adjustments. Numbers most employees never saw. I watched the clip twice. She had turned her camera toward herself, laughing. She hadn't realized what was visible behind her. But someone else might. I picked up my phone. Not to call Daniel, to call compliance. Rachel Moore answered on the second ring. Yes, there's a temporary escort credential issued to L. Carter this morning. I said, Zone C. A brief silence. That's not standard, Rachel replied. I know, more typing on her end. I see it, she said. Issued under HR onboarding. For an intern, I asked. For a shadowing session, Rachel corrected. Her voice had cooled slightly. That's the justification entered. Shadowing. In restricted logistics, I let the word sit between us. Rachel, I said evenly, if that clip spreads and someone screenshots the data behind her, what happens? We breach confidentiality clauses with 3 international carriers? She answered immediately. And we trigger review from our largest client. There it was, not parking, not pride, exposure. Do you want me to escalate, she asked, not should we? Do you want me to? Founder authority still carried weight, not operational, but strategic. Not yet, I said. Freeze any additional escort credentials issued by HR this week. Quietly. You think this is larger? I think Daniel is guarding something, I replied. And Lily may have just walked too close to it. Rachel didn't argue. I'll contain it for now, she said. When the line disconnected, I stared at the paused video frame on my screen. Lily was smiling into her phone. Behind her, sensitive contract data flickered in fluorescent light. She had wanted attention. Daniel had given her access. And neither of them seemed to understand that the real danger wasn't embarrassment. It was traceability. I minimized the window and folded my hands on the desk. The garage had been loud. This part would be quiet. And quiet damage is the kind that lasts. By early afternoon, the building was still running, but the rhythm had shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was procedural. At 12:07 p.m., HR received an automated notice. Temporary escort credential. Hold pending compliance review. No accusation. No alarm, just a hold. Daniel noticed within minutes. I know because he walked past my office at 12:18. Not stopping. Not knocking, but walking slower than usual. His posture had changed. Men who are certain of their authority move in straight lines. Men who feel scrutiny hesitate. He didn't look in. That told me he already suspected who had pulled the thread. At 12:32, my phone lit up again. Not a call, an internal message. Daniel Price compliance is overstepping. Reverse the hold, no greeting, no explanation, just a command. I let 5 minutes pass before replying. Meredith Sloan compliance reports to the board. That was technically true. HR did not outrank compliance. It never had. 3 minutes later, Daniel. This will spook staff. Translation. This will spook me. I stood and walked toward the glass corridor overlooking operations. From above, nothing looked wrong. Trucks were still loading. Dispatchers were still moving freight across states and borders. But access logs had slowed. HR-issued credentials were now flagged automatically. Small friction. Invisible to most. Very visible to Daniel. At 12:47, he appeared in my doorway. He didn't knock. Are you trying to embarrass me? He asked quietly. No witnesses. No raised voice. Just tension pulled tight. I'm trying to understand why an intern was escorted into a restricted data zone. I replied, it was a tour, he said. Shadowing, I corrected. He didn't deny it. She didn't access anything. He continued. She stood in a room. She recorded a room. I said, his jaw tightened. That clip shows contract adjustments. I added, if a competitor freezes that frame, we face inquiries. He held my gaze. For a moment, I saw calculation, not anger. How much have you seen? He asked. There it was. Not, did she do something wrong? Not, is there exposure? How much have you seen? Enough, I said. Silence stretched between us. Then he shifted tactics. You're not operational anymore, he reminded me. You don't understand the negotiations in motion. You mentioned negotiations this morning. I said evenly. With whom? He didn't answer directly. Certain carriers are being repositioned. He said, fee structures adjusted. It's strategic. Strategic. That word again? Through HR, I asked. A flicker in his expression. Small but real. HR had authority over hiring, not carrier penalty structures. Temporary vendor classifications, he replied. It's legal. Legal was not the same as ethical, and neither guaranteed it was compliant with disclosure obligations. You issued multiple escort credentials this week. I said calmly, not just Lily's. His eyes sharpened. You've been watching logs. Yes, and you froze my department. I froze temporary credentials, I corrected. If everything is clean, this resolves quietly. He studied me carefully. You don't want this public, he said. It wasn't a question. No, I replied. I don't. Neither of us did, I replied. A public compliance review would hit share price, client confidence, and upcoming negotiations. But silence only works if there's nothing to hide. He stepped closer to my desk. You're stepping into territory you no longer control, he said. And you're walking interns through rooms they don't belong in. I answered. His composure thinned just slightly. You think this is about a parking space, he asked. No, I said, I think you're moving something under HR cover. Think. We stood in silence, not shouting, not threatening, measuring. Finally, he straightened. If you continue this, he said, you won't just hurt me. That was the closest he'd come to honesty. You'll destabilize the company. There it was. Not ego, exposure. I won't destabilize anything. I said quietly. I'll clarify it. He held my gaze for another second. Then he left without another word. From the corridor window, I watched him walk toward the HR wing. His stride was tighter now, not frantic, but no longer relaxed. Pressure in a company doesn't start with headlines. It starts with friction, access holds, audit trails, questions no one expected to answer. The garage had been noise. This was structure. And structure is far harder to outrun. The next alert came at 3:16 p.m., not from HR, from finance. Rachel forwarded it with one line. You should see this. I opened the attachment. It wasn't dramatic. Just a spreadsheet comparing carrier penalty assessments over the last quarter. At first glance, everything looked routine: late delivery fees, route deviations, standard deductions. Then I noticed the anomaly. 3 carriers had accumulated repeated violations, missed windows, incorrect routing, contract breaches. Normally, those penalties would have been automatic. Instead, their fees had been reclassified, not erased, reclassified, under a temporary designation, preferred vendor adjustment. I sat back slowly. Preferred vendor status wasn't assigned by logistics. It was granted during onboarding, a classification HR could initiate when bringing in new contractor relationships. Temporary. Subject to review, but powerful while active. I scrolled further. The 3 carriers shared something in common. They had all been approved within the last 6 weeks, all entered through HR onboarding, all tied to the same internal sponsor, Daniel Price. I picked up the phone. Rachel answered without greeting. You see it, she said. Yes, they've avoided over $2 million in penalties so far, she continued. If those adjustments had been applied correctly, the carriers would have been flagged for review and possibly replaced. I said, yes. I stared at the numbers again. $2 million in avoided penalties didn't break the company, but it changed leverage. Carrier contracts were negotiated based on performance metrics. Lower penalties meant stronger positioning. Stronger positioning meant influence during upcoming negotiations. The ones Daniel had mentioned. This isn't sloppiness, Rachel said quietly. No, I agreed. It's structured. The system hadn't been hacked. It had been used, carefully, temporarily, long enough to benefit someone before anyone noticed. Do you want me to escalate to the board? Rachel asked. Not yet. If we move too fast, Daniel would frame this as a procedural disagreement. If we waited too long, the pattern would deepen. Pull the full 6-week credential log. I said, every escort, every vendor onboarding, and Daniel. For now, I replied, watching the numbers on my screen, we let him think this is still about a parking space. The audit window began at 2 p.m., 72 hours. That was the timeline the board had approved. Compliance would pull documentation. Outside counsel would review. And HR was instructed to preserve all related records. Preserve, not modify, not reclassify. Preserve. At 4:18 p.m., Rachel called. He's active, she said quietly. Doing what I asked. Backdating memos. I closed my laptop slowly. Daniel wasn't deleting records. That would be obvious. He was filling gaps. Internal justification notes were appearing in the vendor files, each one timestamped earlier in the quarter. Language like strategic reclassification, temporary adjustment, negotiation, leverage, protocol, board, adjacent review. Preliminary, carefully worded. Legally cautious, recently uploaded. Are the system logs clean? I asked. For now, Rachel replied. But metadata doesn't lie. Good. Because that was the mistake most controlled operators made. They edited documents, they forgot timestamps. At 6:02 p.m., another alert appeared. 2 of the 3 flagged carriers had new compliance attachments added to their files. Letters of intent, signed, dated 6 weeks ago. I looked closer. The formatting was identical to templates created last month. Not 6 weeks ago. He's constructing retroactive structure. Rachel said, yes, and it's sophisticated. It was. Daniel wasn't panicking. He was building narrative architecture. If the board saw documented negotiation strategy with formal vendor intent letters, this would look like aggressive but legal positioning, not manipulation. Pull original template creation dates. I said, already did. Created 3 weeks ago. Not 6. That mattered. But not enough on its own. He's trying to turn this into a policy dispute. Rachel continued, not misconduct, which meant he would argue that HR had authority to classify vendors temporarily for strategic purposes. And technically, under certain conditions, it did. The difference was intent and benefit. At 8:11 p.m., Daniel sent a company-wide memo, subject process clarification, vendor strategy alignment. He framed the adjustments as part of a larger operational modernization. He referenced legacy resistance to evolving structures. He didn't use my name. He didn't have to. I read the memo twice. He was repositioning me as obstruction, not whistleblower. If this became founder versus modern leadership, the board would choose continuity, not history. Do you want to counter publicly, Rachel asked. No, I said. Then what I watched, the metadata logs continue to populate in real time. Daniel was building cover, but cover requires consistency, and consistency requires coordination. Freeze external data sync, I said quietly. Just for the 3 carriers. Rachel paused. That will surface discrepancies in live routing. Yes. And if the discrepancies are large, then this stops being internal. There was a long silence on the line. You're certain? She asked. No, I said, but I'm aware. Daniel was rewriting the past. I was about to test the present. 72 hours had felt like pressure. Now it felt like a countdown. And the next move would not be quiet. The freeze went live at 9:02 a.m. Not publicly, not dramatically, just a temporary suspension of live routing sync for 3 carriers flagged under review within 12 minutes. Operations noticed. At 9:14, the first call came in, then the second, then the third. By 9:27, the head of logistics was standing outside my office. They're asking why their penalty dashboards are showing full assessments again. He said quietly, oh, of course they were. For 6 weeks, those carriers had benefited from reduced penalties under the preferred vendor adjustment. Now the system was calculating normally, and the difference was visible. How large, I asked. Significant, he replied. One of them is looking at a 7-figure exposure if the classification doesn't hold. 7 figures. Not hypothetical leverage anymore. Immediate financial impact. Who called, I asked. He hesitated. Carter Freight Solutions. The name settled heavily. Carter? I didn't react outwardly, but I felt the connection snap into place. Owner, I asked. Michael Carter, he said. Mid-sized carrier? Recently expanded? Aggressive growth? Carter Freight Solutions. Lily Carter. I thanked him and waited until he left before picking up the phone. Rachel answered before it finished ringing. Michael Carter, I said. Yes, she replied. I was just about to call you. Relationship registered as independent, she said. But financial disclosures show a private investment infusion 4 months ago from an LLC registered to Daniel's brother-in-law. There it was. Not random. Not strategic positioning. Personal alignment. Does the board know, I asked? No, she answered. Because HR onboarding doesn't require disclosure of extended family interests. Only direct conflicts. A loophole, unintentional or not. It had been used. Carter Freight just demanded reinstatement of their preferred status. Rachel continued, they're threatening to pause shipments pending clarification. Pause shipments. That was escalation. If they halted operations publicly, the issue would surface beyond the building. Have they contacted Daniel, I asked? Yes, and he's in a closed-door call with them now. I stood and walked toward the glass corridor again. Across the floor, through the transparent wall of the HR wing, I could see Daniel seated in a conference room. Phone pressed to his ear, back straight, controlled. He wasn't panicking, like he was negotiating. Likely promising restoration. Likely assuring them this was temporary. The problem was simple. The system was no longer under his exclusive control. If Carter Freight resumed full penalty exposure, their margins shrank. If they paused shipments, operations suffered. Either outcome created visibility, and visibility was the one thing Daniel had worked to avoid. My phone vibrated. A message from Daniel. We need to resolve this immediately, not a command this time, a request. Pressure had shifted. The garage had been noise. The audit had been structure. This was consequence. And it was no longer quiet. The emergency board call began at 4:30 p.m. No presentation this time. No narrative slides. Just facts. Rachel spoke first. She summarized the audit findings in plain language, 3 carriers reclassified under HR onboarding authority, over $2 million in avoided penalties, undisclosed financial connection between 1 carrier and a relative of the HR director, attempted manual override during active audit review, no adjectives, no speculation, just structure. Daniel was given time to respond. He did not deny the investment connection. He described it as indirect. He described the reclassifications as strategic. He described the override request as operational containment. The board listened. Then the chair asked one question. Did you disclose the family investment relationship to the board at any time? Silence, not long. Just long enough. No. Daniel said. That was the moment. Not the penalties, not the freeze, not the carrier suspension. Disclosure. Corporate governance for people our age is not about drama. It's about whether you told the truth when it mattered. The vote was called immediately. Temporary suspension pending full external review. Removal of HR authority, effective immediately. Access credentials deactivated at the close of session. 7 in favor, 2 abstentions, none opposed. Daniel remained composed. He nodded once, professional to the end. Security was not called. It didn't need to be. His badge stopped working before he reached the elevator. Carter Freight resumed shipments the next morning under standard penalty terms. They had recalculated their position overnight. Leverage disappears when oversight becomes real. By the following week, an interim HR director was appointed. Compliance authority was reaffirmed. A new disclosure requirement was added to vendor onboarding. Quiet corrections, structural corrections, no press release, no spectacle, just alignment. The next Monday, I parked again in B4. The sign still read reserved executive this time. No one challenged it. Not because they recognized me, but because policy had been clarified. I shut off the engine and stepped out into the cool air. Daniel had not been arrested. He had not been humiliated. He had been held accountable. For this company, that was enough. Power doesn't need volume. It needs boundaries. And this time, the boundary held.